Over the past couple of years, several big YouTubers have made fantastic videos pointing out specific examples of plagiarism on YouTube, which has spurred a wider movement calling for a more vigorous commitment to citing sources among documentary-type channels, which I think is great. If you want to make a video about a real-life story, then you should cite your sources and you should be transparent about where your information is coming from. But at the same time, I've also noticed that the public reaction to those anti-plagiarism videos has started to stray just a little bit off course. It seems to me as if the lesson that some people have taken away from this whole thing is you should cite your sources so people don't accuse you of plagiarism. It's kind of talked about like a chore, like citing your sources is hard work, but you just gotta suck it up and do it anyway, right? Like I myself get a ton of comments that echo that viewpoint. If you've seen my videos, then you know that I put almost all my sources on the screen as I'm talking about them, and in response, I get a lot of comments that are essentially applauding me for proving that I'm not committing plagiarism. Which, sure, that's a very nice thing to say, don't get me wrong, and I absolutely agree with the general idea there. But I have to say, proving that I'm not doing plagiarism is far from the main reason that I like to cite my sources. No. I cite my sources because I think it makes my videos better. And today, I want to demonstrate why. I want to give you 5 reasons why you should feel excited and not intimidated by the prospect of source transparency. For me, citing sources is not some annoying burden that slows down the creative process. It's a core part of my workflow that fundamentally changes the final product for the better. So let's talk about it. Now, right off the bat, I want to address a certain impression that I occasionally pick up on when people talk about source transparency. Sometimes, people talk about citing sources like it's this supplementary thing to putting a video together. You know, like you do your research and you write your script and you edit, and then at the end, you decide if you're going to make your sources public or not. But in my opinion, if you get serious about making sure that every single thing you say is backed up by something credible, then your entire video creation process will start to revolve around that commitment. I promise you that if I made 2 videos on the same topic, one where I cite my sources and one where I don't, the 2 videos would end up looking completely different by the time they were done. And also, one last thing before we really get into the details here, I want to be crystal clear that I'm definitely not trying to say that everybody should be putting little pictures of their sources on the screen like I do. That's just what works for me. It's not a requirement by any means. In my opinion, just including a list of sources in the description of your video is totally acceptable, as long as you're being honest with yourself about how thoroughly you adhered to those sources, and as long as the average person can easily look at that list and identify where you're getting your information. Like maybe you put little footnote numbers on the screen, or you really meticulously label how you used each source. But all that said, just for the purposes of this video, I am going to speak mostly from the perspective of my channel. I do put images from my sources on the screen, so I'm going to talk about how doing that specifically improves my videos in particular. Nothing in this video is objectively correct advice on making a YouTube video. It's just some stuff that helps me that I hope might help you too. So let's get into some details. So this is probably the most boring and obvious reason for citing sources, but it's also arguably the most important. In my opinion, the more accurate a YouTube video is, the better. And for me, putting my sources on the screen is a fantastic safety net that catches all sorts of mistakes. Basically, every single video that I make, I find some problem that I only noticed because I went to pull a citation and realized that I screwed something up. Sometimes I'll be standing next to a gravestone or whatever, and I'll say something that I thought for sure was true in the moment, and then later I go to add in the citation and whoops, it turns out that I misremembered or misinterpreted something. Like, let me show you an example. A few months ago, I made a video in which I wanted to talk about a certain house in Newport, Rhode Island that has a connection to George Washington. Here is the original audio that I recorded for that video, along with the relevant citations. According to the book, As Washington walked up to the house, a little kid saw him and said, "Why, Father, George Washington is a man." To which the dad replied, "Yes, my son, only a man." So kind of an interesting little anecdote there, right? It's sort of a reminder that even great historical figures are just people at the end of the day. The only problem, though, is that I messed up the story. It wasn't the kid's father that said that George Washington was only a man. It was George Washington himself. For whatever reason, I misread that passage the first time that I looked at it, and I screwed up the story. Literally, the only reason that I noticed the mistake later is because I went to pull the citation and realized that I had messed up. Luckily, that was only a very small part of a larger video, so I was able to handle the issue, but still, if I wasn't citing my sources, I would have 100% put wrong information in my YouTube video there. Which just goes to show, if you genuinely care about making accurate content, then you should want to cite your sources because it will help you catch mistakes. Even if you're not putting sources on the screen, just double and triple checking that you got your information right will help you notice way more errors than you might think. So I just gave you an ethical reason for why you should want to cite your sources, because it makes your videos more accurate. But like I said, that's pretty obvious. So now I'm going to give you an artistic reason, a creative reason, if you will. And specifically, I want you to remember this is just one creative reason out of a potentially infinite pool of ideas. I heavily encourage you to think for yourself about how you can creatively integrate sources into your own work. And I'm going to try to get you started by telling you about what works for me and the type of content that I create. And I'm going to do it with the aid of Harry Houdini, the famous magician from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now, this is going to kind of be ironic in a video about citing sources, but I'm going to tell you a story now with 0 citations. See, when I was about 10 years old, I read a book about Houdini that included a little story that I think really nicely demonstrates the point that I want to make here. The only problem is I have no memory of where I read that story, and I've searched for so long trying to find where I got it from with 0 success. So please just consider this like a hypothetical story about Houdini and not necessarily a fact, because there's a very strong possibility that I'm just misremembering something that I read as a 10-year-old. So think of this like a thought exercise rather than a factual story about Houdini. But anyway, the story went a little bit like this, at least as far as I can recall. At some point in his career, Harry Houdini learned how to escape from a locked safe. He would have an assistant lock him up inside, and then he would dramatically pick the lock from inside the safe and free himself with no outside help. And Houdini was very proud of this new trick, and so he debuted it one night at a performance. And he had himself locked up in the safe, and then he picked the lock in only a few seconds, and he burst open the door, and he stood there on stage in front of his audience feeling a great sense of triumph. But to his disappointment, the reaction from the crowd felt kind of muted. Like there was cheering for sure, but a whole lot less than Houdini expected for such an incredible feat. And what's worse, every time Houdini did this new trick, he got the same kind of mediocre response. And so one day, Houdini decided to try things a little differently. At his next performance, he had himself locked up in the safe like normal, but this time, instead of picking the lock and just busting out in a few seconds, he sat in there for a while. And he kind of banged on the walls of the safe a little bit, and he made a whole bunch of noise, and then finally, after about a half hour of just sitting in there, he picked the lock, and he burst out of the safe, and his hair is all drenched with sweat, and his face is flushed with effort, and this time, the audience goes crazy, and there's huge cheers, this big, giant reaction, like everybody loves the trick. Now, in my opinion, you can glean quite a few lessons about performance from this story. The obvious one is that a greater struggle equals a greater triumph. When Houdini escaped from the safe in only a few seconds, it kind of signaled to the audience that what he was doing was really not all that interesting or difficult or impressive. Like, he got out of there in seconds, so why should the crowd be invested? Like, it's not much of a trick if he just busts out of there easy peasy with zero difficulty, right? Whereas when Houdini sits in there for a half an hour before finally coming out, it makes the trick seem way more laborious. Like, wow, look how hard it was for the great hairy Houdini to get out of that safe. Like, what a spectacular effort that must have been. Now, to be clear, I'm definitely not trying to say that I trick people into thinking that making videos is harder than it is by citing sources, because like I said, I do not even consider citing sources to be a chore in the first place. So for me, the real important lesson here is that sometimes you want your audience to feel like they are a part of the performance. You want to take them on a ride a little bit. When Houdini busts out of that safe in seconds, the audience hardly even has a chance to comprehend what's going on. Like, he's just in there and then he's out, like nothing. But when Houdini takes his time, the audience starts to worry and they start to stress about if the trick is going wrong, and they wonder if Houdini is ever going to make it out of there. And so when he finally does escape, they can see their anxiety reflected in Harry's struggle. You know, like, I was out here in the audience and I'm worrying and agonizing about Houdini escaping, just like he was probably up there in that safe worrying and agonizing about getting out. Like, it's almost like the audience is a part of the toil and struggle that seemingly went into the trick. So Harry escaping is a relief for both him and the audience. And in my mind, citing sources can accomplish a somewhat similar goal in a YouTube video. I want you to know where I'm getting my info from because I imagine that it helps you feel closer to the story. When you were looking at the very same newspaper articles that I use to get my information, then you are literally learning about the video topic in exactly the same way that I learned about it. Like, here's the newspaper article that I used for this section of the video, and now that you've seen it, you have the same information that I do. Like, you can almost imagine yourself piecing together the story in the exact same way that I did. Now, this isn't an exact parallel, of course, because I'm not deceiving you like Houdini kind of was with his audience, but the general principle is still the same, I think. Especially because it's just cool to know that I got information out of a newspaper article from 1879 or some book that I found in a library in rural Massachusetts. Sometimes the story that I'm telling in a video isn't even halfway as interesting as how I learned about the story in the first place. Like, check this out. One of the most popular videos on my channel is called A Monument to Loathing. And at its core, the story that I tell in that video is extremely simple. There's a big giant grave monument in Eastford, Connecticut that was erected for a rich man named Loren Bosworth. And when Bosworth died in 1903, it was discovered that his will stipulated that he wanted 1/6 of his estate to be spent on a headstone. The problem, though, is once you added up all of his property and assets, Bosworth's estate was way, way bigger than probably even he expected, and so 1/6 of his estate became a huge amount of money that was legally obliged towards building this gigantic gravestone. And that story is kind of interesting on its own. But in the video, I spend a whole ton of time talking about how I drove around to all these random libraries and historical societies in Eastern Connecticut, and I'm piecing together the story using all these little bits of information, and finally, I find this sort of holy grail source at a library that brought the whole story together. So I'm just standing there, right? I'm nervous now. I'm thinking, oh, I'm out of my league. These guys are pros. I'm just a novice. But I suck it up. I say, hey, you got any books on the history of Eastford, Connecticut? Any kind of reference like that up here? The guy goes, I don't think so. It's really mostly Putnam up here. And then the woman at the computer goes, wait, actually, we do have one book on Eastford, Connecticut. And she walks down one of the aisles deep in. I'm watching her hand go up to the aisle. She grabs a book. She pulls it out. and it's Cameron's 1976 Eastford history book, the one that I just read about and the one that I was looking for. And I say, hot dog, I grab that, I sit down, and I get reading, and I find everything. So in a way, there's now kind of two stories in that video. There's the story of the headstone, and there's also the story of how I found the information about the headstone. If I just told you that story with zero sources, to me, that would sort of be like Houdini busting out of the safe with no issue. It feels a little distant, like Harry gets out of there easily in a way that isn't relatable or interesting to the audience, just like me telling you the story with no sources isn't very relatable. But if I show you how I got my information, then all of a sudden, everything seems way more personal. Like you can imagine yourself asking around at all these old libraries and reading through these old books, trying to find information on some cool local legend from your own hometown. Just like how watching Houdini try and escape from a safe for a half an hour might make you start to imagine what it would be like to be trapped inside the safe yourself. And thus, in both cases, the final product feels more engaging and more rewarding. Like, I get a ton of emails from people asking me how they can start researching things in the same way that I do, and I genuinely believe that it's because citing my sources makes what I do seem manageable for the average person. It seems like something that anybody could do if they put their mind to it. Which, by the way, is absolutely the truth. Nothing that I do is really all that difficult from a skill perspective, and I 100% encourage people to go out and see what kind of cool stuff they can dig up on their own, because it's really not that hard. But all that said, again, I think it's important to remember that I'm just talking about my own personal experience here. This is all just stuff that helps me make videos that I'm personally proud of. I'm definitely not saying that putting your sources on the screen is like always artistically superior to not doing it. Like, for example, if you're a YouTube channel with like a super high production value and you have all these crazy animations and graphics and you want to come across as this like super professional outfit, then maybe it's actually better for you to not come off as relatable and easy to replicate. Like maybe sometimes you do want to come off like this authority on the topic who just knows everything, because that makes your particular videos better. So maybe for you, just doing the thorough list of sources in the description still provides clarity on where you got your information, while also preserving the particular aesthetic or tone that you might want for your project. In the end here, all I'm really saying is that deciding how you're going to cite your sources is a creative decision as much as it is an ethical one. And I think it's worth spending some time thinking about how the method in which you cite sources changes how your audience might interpret your video. Another common sentiment that I see sometimes is this idea that a citation is proof that what you're saying is correct. You know, like, here's what I say in my YouTube video, and here is my citation to prove that I'm right. Like, here is my evidence showing that I'm factually correct. And sure, yeah, sometimes it works like that, but sometimes it doesn't. I think it's important to keep in mind that a citation is not always a black and white fact. Just because you read something in a book does not automatically mean that you've discovered an irrefutably true piece of information, because maybe the source is wrong, or maybe it's outdated, or maybe it's written in a tone that leaves things up to interpretation, and the way that you read the source doesn't always line up with how somebody else might read it. Sometimes there's just no objectively correct story that can be gleaned from reading about a topic. There's just my interpretation of the available material and your interpretation of the available material. And maybe my interpretation is totally different from yours, which is absolutely okay. I always want to come off like I'm showing you what I found rather than telling you a whole bunch of facts. And for me, citing my sources is a great way to accomplish that goal. If you check the comments on basically every single video that I've ever made, guaranteed there's going to be somebody in there saying that I misread something, or I overemphasized something, or I just generally drew the wrong conclusion about some piece of information. And sometimes I disagree, and sometimes I agree. Like here, let me show you an example. Recently, I made a video about an Oregon state senator that tried to ban popcorn in movie theaters because he thought it was loud and distracting. And this is how I opened up that video. In 1949, Oregon State Senator Dean Walker announced that he wanted to ban popcorn in movie theaters, and right away, newspapers all across the continent picked up the story. Everyone had an opinion. Like this Canadian journalist who said that anyone ever afflicted at the movies by a bag-rattling popcorn muncher will undoubtedly support the senator. Now, the part that I want you to focus on here is this particular citation. As you just heard, I thought this journalist was saying that anyone who gets annoyed by popcorn in theaters will support the popcorn ban. But some commenters thought that the journalist was just saying that they might empathize with the idea that popcorn is annoying, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would support the bill. Ultimately, this just comes down to the word sympathize. I was reading the newspaper with the political definition of sympathize in mind. You know, if you sympathize with a particular cause in a political sense, then you support the cause. And so to me, sympathize in this context is essentially a synonym for support. But you could also read that article with the more general meaning of sympathize in mind, which is that you just understand where the other person is coming from, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them. If I didn't cite my sources, then this kind of dialogue just straight up could not happen. You would just have to watch my videos and take my word for it. Whatever I say goes. Which again, kind of goes back to what I said in the accuracy section. The less I feel like I might be misleading my audience, the better I think my video ultimately becomes. I think this concept can take a little bit of rewiring your brain to fully embrace, because it is hard to read somebody disagreeing with you and not instinctively take it as an attack. But I think it's very rewarding to accept the idea that you are citing your sources not necessarily to prove that you're right, but instead to make it clear how you came to your conclusions. You're not always supporting a case. Sometimes you're just mapping out your line of thinking, and the citations are just your building blocks. And also, if you actually are trying to make a point and you actually are trying to convince people of something and you are trying to make a strictly argumentative video, then showing how you came to your conclusion might very well be just as convincing as the conclusion itself. Like, being clear with your information can only strengthen your case. So either way, citing your sources is going to help your video. All right, this is another really simple one, so I'm going to use a simple example to demonstrate my point. I'm about to show you two drawings of a headstone in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The headstone is for a doctor who used to always pay the check when he went to dinner with his friends. And whenever he paid, he would yell, "This is on me," and then grab the check, which became like his catchphrase. He'd pay for everyone, and then he'd say, "This is on me." So when he died, he wanted "This is on me" inscribed on his headstone as like a double joke, because it's his catchphrase, and also because the headstone is literally on top of him in the grave, right? So this headstone is on me. It's a pretty good joke. Now check this out. Here are two different drawings of that headstone. This one that kind of looks like a tomb that has "This is on me" written on it. And this one that just looks like a big rock with "This is on me" carved into it. Now, if I asked you which one of these drawings was more likely to accurately depict how the headstone actually looked in real life, it would be kind of hard for you to guess, right? Like, how are you supposed to know? But if I tell you that I found the Boulder one in a newspaper from New Jersey and the tomb one from a newspaper in Australia, then you might be able to guess that the New Jersey drawing is more accurate, because of course it might be more likely that information would accurately travel from Rhode Island to New Jersey in 1929 than it is that information would travel from Rhode Island to Australia without being distorted. Now, of course, this isn't a rule or anything. The Australia newspaper might very well have been right, and the New Jersey paper might very well have been wrong. But still, by giving you the source where I found the drawings, you now have more information available to you that you can use to make a judgment for yourself. which is exactly what I want. I do not want to be the sole arbiter of correct and incorrect. I want to give you every tool possible to come to a conclusion completely on your own, which very nicely leads into my final point. This last one is very compelling to me, and it's a huge motivator for why I like to cite my sources. And I'd like to explain this one by demonstrating something to you. This is a video that I made a few years ago about a gigantic man who went on an insane crime spree in Pennsylvania back in 1881. The man's name is Dennis Fenton. And if you Google Dennis Fenton, literally nothing comes up about that story besides my video. As far as I'm aware, my video is the only easily available source of information on that topic. And check this out. About a year ago, I made a video about a phenomenon that I noticed in old newspapers where journalists used to name every random criminal after Jack the Ripper. So a criminal that uses a knife to attack people in 1906 might be labeled Jack the Stabber by the local newspapers. Or if somebody breaks a window with a rock, the papers might call them Jack the Smasher. Or if somebody's going around biting people, the papers are going to call them Jack the Biter. And as far as I'm aware, my video is the only project on that particular topic. Nobody else has ever made anything substantial on that little quirk of journalistic history. A lot of my videos are like this. Quite often, a video that I make becomes the most easily accessible source of information on that particular topic. And I'm absolutely not trying to say this to brag or act like I'm breaking new ground as some kind of hotshot historian or whatever, because like I said, anybody could really do what I do if they put their mind to it. Instead, the point that I want to make here is this. Imagine for a second that I made that video about Dennis Fenton and I didn't cite my sources at all. And not only did I not put any citations on the screen, I also did not put any sources in the description. I just completely did not make it clear whatsoever where I was getting my information from. Now, let's say that I write something incorrect into the script and I don't catch it because I'm not citing my sources. And then on top of that, I totally misinterpret a passage in an old book. And again, because I'm not citing my sources, it's basically impossible for anybody to notice that I misinterpreted something. And let's say that I secretly got a huge chunk of my information from some guy that I met at a bar one day who says that Dennis Fenton was his great-great-grandfather, and I don't tell anyone that my source is just some random guy that I just met. And let's say I put out that video with all those inaccuracies and I don't cite my sources at all. What would be the chances that anybody would ever clean up the misinformation that I just spread? Basically zero, because you'd have to essentially go through and redo all of my research from scratch to even begin to realize that I might have messed something up. And so to me, citing sources is not just about avoiding plagiarism accusations, and it's not just about making a video as accurate as you can. It's about a responsibility to give people the tools to pick up where you left off, which is a very comforting sentiment, at least for me, because the last thing that I want to do is permanently screw up the public perception of a story forever. Now, of course, I'm being hyperbolic by calling this chapter freedom, because I definitely don't think that citing sources is a license to just screw everything up and be like, oh, well, I messed up, sure, but it's your responsibility to find my mistakes, because I cited my sources. So if people get the wrong idea, it's on them. It's not on me. They should be checking that list of sources that I put in the description. Because, of course, the average person is not going through my videos with a fine-toothed comb, like checking every citation and every book and newspaper to make sure that I didn't get something wrong. Of course, if I say something incorrect in a video, then that inaccuracy is going to spread. But at least I'm not slamming the door shut on everybody who might want to check things out for themselves. Because whenever you create a public project about history or science or really anything, you're kind of inserting yourself into the lineage of that topic. Your work does not exist in a vacuum. Your project is not some separate, distinct thing from everybody else's work on the subject. Because who knows, maybe 100 years from now, you might become somebody's source on a topic. So in my opinion, it's much easier to feel happy with your work when you know that you're not making it harder for people to find the truth in the future. And so in conclusion, you should want to cite your sources because it makes your videos more accurate, because how you cite your sources can change your video from a creative perspective, because there's not always one correct interpretation of a citation, because you should let your audience decide for themselves if a source is credible, and because you should want to leave the door open for people in the future to easily and seamlessly pick up where you left off. Thank you for watching. Hey, a couple more things real quick before I go. First off, I want to reiterate again that all of this is just stuff that I think about when I make videos. Because at the end of the day, I am a small YouTube channel with only 90,000 subscribers. Like, I do not want to come off like I'm some noble champion of source transparency and everybody needs to do everything exactly like me. Like, I just wanted to use my own channel as a lens to try and reframe the conversation a bit. Because for me, citing sources is a strictly positive thing that I'm happy to do, that I want to do, and I'm hoping that maybe my experience and perspective might help people find some real satisfaction out of citing sources themselves. And second, I also really hope that this video does not come off like an attack on people who have made videos calling out plagiarism on YouTube. I want to be crystal clear that I think doing that is a strictly beneficial undertaking, and I'm not criticizing them or saying that they should have done things any differently. I am very specifically criticizing how some people have reacted to those videos, not the videos themselves. And that's about it. I'll see you next time.